The early morning sun streamed through the large windows of Washington Dulles International Airport as Captain James Wilson made his way toward the departure gate. His polished boots clicked against the shiny floor, drawing occasional glances from travelers who noticed his crisp military uniform. After 12 long years of service and 2 difficult tours in Afghanistan, he was finally heading home to San Francisco. James checked his watch, still 30 minutes before boarding. Finding an empty seat near the gate, he sat down and pulled out his phone to text his mom. "On my way. Can't wait to see everyone." He smiled, thinking about the surprise party his sister had planned. She thought he didn't know about it, but their cousin had accidentally mentioned it during their last video call. The past 18 months had been rougher than most. His unit had faced dangerous missions, and he'd lost 2 good friends. Those memories still kept him awake some nights. But now, after months of paperwork and debriefings, he was finally free to go home and decompress. Attention passengers on Flight 372 to San Francisco. We will begin boarding in 5 minutes, starting with our first-class passengers and those needing special assistance. James gathered his things. He normally wouldn't splurge on a first-class ticket, but after spending so many nights on hard cots or sometimes just the ground, he figured he deserved a comfortable seat for the 6-hour flight. He'd saved up specifically for this, wanting to arrive home rested rather than cramped and exhausted. "First-class passengers may now board," the gate agent announced. James stood, shouldering his small duffel bag. He traveled light, a habit from years of military life. As he handed his boarding pass to the agent, she smiled warmly. "Thank you for your service, Captain. Have a pleasant flight." Walking down the jet bridge, James felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. In just a few hours, he'd be home eating his mom's famous pot roast, the one dish he'd craved most during his time overseas. His dad would probably want to hear all about his missions, though James wasn't sure how much he wanted to share just yet. Some experiences were still too fresh, too painful. The flight attendant at the plane's entrance greeted passengers with a rehearsed smile. When she saw James, though, her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced at his boarding pass. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice noticeably cooler than it had been for the businessman ahead of him. James nodded politely and continued into the cabin. The first-class section looked as comfortable as he hoped, wide leather seats with plenty of legroom, exactly what he needed after months of discomfort. He found his seat, 3A, a window spot with no one yet in the aisle seat beside it. As he prepared to sit down, he noticed an older couple across the aisle watching him. The woman smiled kindly, and the man gave him a respectful nod. James returned the gesture before stowing his duffel in the overhead bin. Just as he was about to settle in, a hand tapped his shoulder firmly. He turned to find the same flight attendant who had greeted him at the door. Her name tag read Linda, and her smile had completely disappeared. "Excuse me," she said, voice low but sharp. "I think there's been a mistake with your seating assignment." James pulled out his boarding pass again. 3A, right? This is 3A. Linda glanced around the cabin quickly before leaning closer. "First class is actually full today. There's been a system error. I'll need you to move to economy." James looked around, confused. He could clearly see 2 empty seats in the first-class cabin, including the one he was assigned to. The couple across the aisle exchanged glances, and the businessman in front turned slightly, listening to the conversation. "But my boarding pass," James began. "I'm sorry," Linda cut him off, not sounding sorry at all. "There's been a mistake. Now if you'll follow me to economy, please." James stood in the aisle, boarding pass still in hand, as other passengers continued to file onto the plane. Some glanced curiously at the situation unfolding in first class. The flight attendant, Linda, crossed her arms and tapped her foot impatiently. "I don't understand," James said quietly, determined to stay calm. "I purchased this seat weeks ago. My boarding pass clearly shows 3A. Linda's smile tightened. "As I said, there's been a system error. These things happen." She lowered her voice to almost a whisper. "The first-class section is completely full today." James looked around again. The 2 empty seats were still very much empty, including his assigned seat by the window. He'd spent nearly a month's worth of savings on this ticket. After years of military service, months away from his family, and countless nights of uncomfortable sleep, this small comfort meant a lot to him. "Mount, my seat is right here, and it's empty," he said, gesturing to 3A. "I specifically saved up for this seat." Linda's eyes darted around the cabin before she leaned in closer. "Look, these seats are reserved for certain types of passengers. I'm sure you'll be more comfortable in economy with the other passengers." The businessman seated in front of James turned around fully now, no longer pretending not to listen. The older couple across the aisle exchanged shocked glances. "Certain types?" James repeated, the words hanging in the air. His heart sank as the meaning became clear. 12 years serving his country, and here he was, being judged by the color of his skin. "I don't want to make a scene," Linda said, though her increasingly loud tone was doing exactly that. "Please follow me to economy now." James took a deep breath. His father had always taught him to pick his battles wisely. Was this worth fighting over? He thought of all the times he'd stepped back, stayed quiet, let things slide for the sake of peace. But something about today, perhaps the uniform he wore or the long journey home, made this different. "I paid for this seat," he said firmly but respectfully. "I have a valid boarding pass. Unless you can show me that someone else has the same seat assignment, I'll be sitting where I paid to sit." Linda's face flushed red. "Are you refusing to comply with flight crew instructions?" She emphasized the last words as if they carried special weight. "That's a federal offense." A few more passengers had stopped in the aisle, creating a small traffic jam. The tension in the air was palpable. James felt his palms growing sweaty, but he stood his ground. "I'm not refusing to comply with reasonable instructions," he replied evenly. "I'm simply asking to sit in the seat I purchased." Just then, a woman in a smartly tailored business suit who had been quietly observing from her first-class seat across the aisle spoke up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying authority without being loud. "I couldn't help overhearing. Is there a problem with this gentleman's seat assignment?" Linda turned, clearly startled by the intervention. "This is a crew matter, ma'am." "I see," the woman said, reaching for her phone. "Well, I find it interesting that you claim first class is full when I can clearly see empty seats, including the one this officer was assigned." Another passenger, a man with silver-rimmed glasses and a calm demeanor, stood up from his seat a few rows ahead. "I believe I heard you suggest that certain types of passengers belong in certain sections of the aircraft. As an attorney, I find that statement concerning." Linda's confident demeanor faltered. She glanced nervously toward the front of the plane where another flight attendant was helping an elderly passenger. The businessman who had been listening turned fully in his seat now. "I fly this route every week," he announced loudly. "And I've never heard of a system error that allows a ticket to be printed, scanning at the gate, but somehow becoming invalid once on the plane." James stood still, surprised by the sudden support. The woman with the business suit was now openly taking photos of the empty seats with her phone, while the attorney had pulled out a small notebook and was writing something down. Linda's face had gone from red to slightly pale. She looked between the growing number of watchful eyes in first class and James in his military uniform. I'll need to speak with the head flight attendant," she finally said, backing away slightly. The woman in the business suit watched Linda hurry toward the front of the plane. She hadn't planned on getting involved in anything today. Diane Reynolds was exhausted after a week of meetings, and all she'd wanted was a quiet flight home. But watching that flight attendant try to move a soldier from his rightful seat had struck a nerve she couldn't ignore. As regional director for a competing airline, Diane recognized discrimination when she saw it. She'd spent 15 years in the industry and had personally fired staff for similar behavior. What made this situation worse was the man being treated this way wore a uniform that represented service to their country. Diane discreetly angled her phone to capture a photo of the empty seats in first class, making sure to include the seat numbers. She then opened her notes app and quickly jotted down Linda's name from her badge and a summary of what she'd heard. Airlines took these incidents seriously, or at least they should, and evidence would be important. "You okay?" she asked James, who still stood in the aisle, looking uncomfortable as the center of attention. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you for speaking up," he replied, his posture straight but his expression betraying his discomfort. The older gentleman with silver-rimmed glasses approached from his seat. Tom Chen, he introduced himself quietly. I practice civil rights law. What happened here was textbook discrimination. He handed James a business card. Keep that, just in case. The older couple across the aisle were whispering to each other. The woman looked upset, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. My son's in the Navy, she explained when she caught James looking her way. I can't imagine someone treating him like this after everything you boys do for us. More passengers continued boarding, creating a traffic jam in the aisle as people tried to navigate around James and the small group that had formed. Some looked annoyed at the holdup, while others sensed something was happening and slowed down to observe. Diane noticed Linda had returned with another flight attendant, a tall man with a senior crew member pin on his uniform. She could read the situation immediately from their body language. Linda was gesturing animatedly while the senior crew member listened with a deepening frown. You might want to get your camera ready, Tom Chen murmured to Diane, noticing her documentation. Whatever happens next will matter. The senior flight attendant approached the group, his expression professional but concerned. Good morning, everyone. I'm David, the lead flight attendant. I understand there's some confusion about seating. Before Linda could speak, Diane stepped forward. This soldier has a confirmed first-class ticket for seat 3A. Your colleague suggested there was a system error despite visible empty seats, and implied that certain types of passengers shouldn't be in first class. Her voice was calm but carried authority. Several of us witnessed the exchange. David's eyes widened slightly. He turned to James. Captain, may I see your boarding pass, please? James handed it over. David examined it and nodded. This is absolutely valid. Seat 3A is indeed your assigned seat. He looked around at the first-class cabin. And as everyone can see, it's available. Linda started to protest. But the passenger manifest. The manifest shows exactly what the captain's boarding pass shows. David cut her off firmly. There's no discrepancy here. His tone made it clear he understood exactly what had happened. He turned back to James. Captain, please accept my sincere apologies for this misunderstanding. Your seat is 3A as confirmed. Please make yourself comfortable. The businessman who had spoken up earlier nodded in approval. Several other passengers who had been watching broke into spontaneous applause. Thank you, James said simply, finally moving to take his rightful seat by the window. David turned to Linda, his expression now stern. We need to speak privately, he said in a low voice. Please come with me. As they walked away, Diane caught Tom Chen's eye. Without words, they'd both understood that this situation, while resolved for now, shouldn't end here. Linda's behavior reflected a deeper problem that needed addressing. Diane opened her phone again and began typing an email to a contact she had in this airline's corporate office. The subject line read, Urgent. Discriminatory incident on Flight 372. Meanwhile, James settled into his seat, the leather cool against his back. He stared out the window at the airport tarmac, processing what had just happened and the unexpected support he'd received from complete strangers. The tension in the first-class cabin lingered even as James settled into his seat. Several passengers were still talking in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed. Tom Chen, the civil rights attorney, had returned to his seat but kept glancing back toward where Linda and David had disappeared behind the curtain separating the galley from the passenger cabin. Mind if I sit here for a minute? Diane asked, gesturing to the empty aisle seat next to James. When he nodded, she slipped into the seat. I'm Diane, by the way. James Wilson, he replied, extending his hand. Thank you for speaking up earlier. No need to thank me, she said, shaking his hand firmly. What she did was wrong on every level. I've worked in the airline industry for 15 years, and I've seen this happen before. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. Unfortunately, so have I. A flight attendant, not Linda, approached with 2 glasses of pre-departure water. Compliments of the captain, she said with a genuine smile. He'd like to speak with you after we land, if that's all right. James accepted the water with surprise. Of course. The older couple across the aisle leaned forward. With Bill and Nancy, the man said, We want you to know we're writing to the airline as soon as we land. That kind of behavior is unacceptable. Especially towards someone serving our country, Nancy added, her eyes still damp with emotion. James was overwhelmed by the support. Throughout his military career, he'd handled difficult situations by staying calm and focused on the mission. That approach had served him well today too, but the unexpected alliance of strangers standing up for him touched something deep. "I appreciate that more than you know," he said quietly. The boarding process was nearly complete when David returned to the first-class cabin. Linda was noticeably absent. He stopped by James's seat. "Captain Wilson, I want to personally apologize again for what happened. Linda has been removed from this flight and will not be serving today. We've arranged for another crew member to take her place." David's professional tone couldn't completely hide his embarrassment. "The captain also extends his apologies and his gratitude for your service." Tom Chen, who had been listening from his seat, spoke up. "I hope the airline understands this isn't just about one flight attendant having a bad day," he said. "This reflects systemic issues that need addressing." David nodded. "I assure you this incident will be fully reported and addressed at the highest levels." He turned back to James. "Is there anything else we can do to make your flight more comfortable today?" James shook his head. "Just getting to my correct seat is enough, thank you." As David moved away to help with final boarding preparations, Diane pulled out her business card and handed it to James. "I meant to give you this earlier. I'm a regional director at Pacific Airways. If you have any trouble with the formal complaint process, please contact me directly." The businessman who had spoken up earlier turned around in his seat. "George Thompson," he introduced himself. "I've got over 2 million miles with this airline and sit on their customer advisory board. I'd be happy to add my voice to any complaint you file." James tucked both business cards into his pocket, touched by how quickly these strangers had become allies. The last thing he'd wanted today was to cause a scene or become the center of attention. He just wanted to get home to his family. But there was something powerful about this moment, about people from different backgrounds united in standing against something wrong. "Thank you all," he said simply. "This means a lot." From the cabin speakers, the captain's voice announced they were ready for departure. As the plane began pushing back from the gate, James gazed out the window. The morning sun reflected off the terminal windows, bright and clear. For the first time since boarding, he felt himself relax into his seat, the seat he had paid for, the seat he deserved. Diane returned to her own seat for takeoff, but not before giving James a reassuring smile. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "But I think good things will come from what happened here today." The flight was halfway to San Francisco when David, the lead flight attendant, approached James again. The cabin lights had been dimmed, and most passengers were either watching movies or napping. "Captain Wilson," David said quietly, "the pilot asked if you'd like to visit the cockpit when we land. He's a former Air Force man himself." James smiled. "I'd like that. Thank you." As David turned to go, James noticed he was carrying a small stack of comment cards. Several passengers had apparently asked for them, something rarely seen in the age of online reviews. The incident had clearly struck a chord with everyone who witnessed it. Across the aisle, Diane was typing rapidly on her laptop. She'd spent most of the flight working on what appeared to be a detailed report. Occasionally, she paused to chat with Tom Chen, who had moved to a nearby seat during the meal service and never returned to his original spot. "Just sent it," Diane announced, closing her laptop with a satisfied click. She noticed James looking over. "Email to the airline's VP of Customer Experience. She's an old friend from flight school." "You didn't have to do that," James said. Diane shook her head. "Yes, I did. This isn't just about one bad flight attendant. It's about making sure airlines create a culture where this doesn't happen." She paused. "And it's about believing people who say this happens to them." The older couple, Bill and Nancy, returned from a walk around the cabin. Nancy stopped by James's seat and placed a small package of cookies on his tray table. "They're homemade," she explained with grandmotherly warmth. "I always bring them when we fly to visit our grandkids. Our son in the Navy loves these." "Thank you, ma'am," James said, genuinely touched by the simple gesture. 2 rows ahead, a young woman who had been quietly observing everything turned around. "I uploaded a video of what happened during boarding," she said. "It's already getting shared like crazy." James felt a mix of emotions at this news. He hadn't wanted to become a social media story, but perhaps the attention would help prevent similar situations for others. The last hour of the flight passed quickly. As they began their descent into San Francisco, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed. What had started as a group of strangers had become something like allies. Passengers who would normally never speak to each other were exchanging contact information and discussing what they'd witnessed. After landing, David returned to escort James to the cockpit. The pilot, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, stood to greet him. "Captain Wilson, I'm Richard Bennett. Flew C-130s for 12 years before joining commercial aviation." He shook James's hand firmly. "I want to personally apologize for what happened today." "Thank you, sir," James replied. "I've filed my own report about the incident," Captain Bennett continued, "and I've spoken directly with our Chief Operating Officer. He's waiting to speak with you by phone when you're ready." James blinked in surprise. "The COO?" "Yes, sir. This situation has already reached the executive level. They're taking it very seriously." When James finally exited the cockpit and walked into the terminal, he was surprised to find several passengers from first class waiting for him, including Diane, Tom, and the older couple. "We wanted to make sure you got off okay," Diane explained. "And to let you know we're all following through," Tom added. "I've already spoken with 2 colleagues who specialize in transportation discrimination cases. They're standing by if you need them." Bill stepped forward with his phone. "The video that young lady took has over 50,000 views already. People are demanding the airline respond." James hadn't expected any of this when he boarded his flight home. He just wanted a comfortable seat after years of service. But standing in the terminal surrounded by strangers who had become unexpected champions, he realized something important had happened today. "I don't know what to say," James admitted. "Except thank you." "No," Nancy said, patting his arm gently. "Thank you for your service and for standing your ground today. Sometimes it takes one person to make others find their courage." As the group began to disperse, each heading to their next destination, Diane hung back. "The airline's already called an emergency meeting of their executive team," she said. "This story is just beginning." 2 days after landing in San Francisco, James was still trying to process everything that had happened. He sat at his mother's kitchen table, scrolling through news articles on his phone. The story had exploded overnight. The video of the incident had been viewed millions of times, and major news networks had picked it up. "You're famous now," his younger sister teased, sliding a cup of coffee in front of him. "Not exactly what I was hoping for on my leave," James replied with a small smile. His phone buzzed with another email notification. Since the flight, he'd received messages from dozens of strangers sharing similar experiences. Veterans groups had reached out offering support. 3 different civil rights organizations had contacted him about using his story in their training materials. "Have you heard anything from the airline?" his mother asked, joining them at the table. James nodded. "Their CEO called personally this morning." "The CEO?" his sister exclaimed. "Wow. What did they say?" his mother pressed. James took a sip of coffee before answering. "They've put Linda on administrative leave pending investigation. The airline is reviewing all previous complaints against her. Apparently there have been several that were never properly addressed." His phone rang, displaying Diane Reynolds' name. She'd been keeping him updated on developments from her industry connections. "Hello," James answered, putting the call on speaker so his family could hear. "James, have you seen the news?" Diane's voice was charged with excitement. "The airline just released their official statement. They're not just addressing what happened to you, they're announcing a complete overhaul of their training programs." James quickly opened the news link Diane texted over. The airline's statement was comprehensive. They'd apologized for the inexcusable treatment of Captain Wilson and acknowledged that the incident reflected deeper issues that require immediate attention. The company announced a new partnership with a diversity training organization and promised additional training for all customer-facing staff. "They've reached out to me too." Tom Chen's voice joined the call. Diane had apparently connected him. "They want help developing anti-discrimination policies. This is actually happening, James. They're taking real steps." James's mother squeezed his shoulder, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She had raised him to stay strong in the face of discrimination, to work twice as hard and keep his head high. Seeing an entire company acknowledge wrongdoing and commit to change meant more to her than she could express. "There's something else," Diane continued. "That flight attendant, Linda. One of my contacts did some digging. Turns out she's been with the airline for 18 years, and there's a pattern of complaints against her that somehow never made it into her permanent record." "How is that possible?" James asked. "Someone was protecting her," Tom cut in, "but not anymore. The airline is reviewing all passenger complaints from the past 5 years to see if there are other incidents that were swept under the rug." James's sister, who worked in human resources, shook her head. "That's a lawsuit waiting to happen." "Already happening," Tom confirmed. 2 former passengers have come forward with documentation of similar experiences. They're considering a class action. Outside, rain began to patter against the window. James watched the droplets trace patterns down the glass, thinking about how one moment on one flight had sparked such far-reaching consequences. "There's one more thing," Diane said, her voice softening. "The airline wants to offer you lifetime premium status and unlimited first-class upgrades when available." James's family looked at him expectantly. "I don't need special treatment," he said after a moment. "But I do have an idea." "What kind of idea?" Diane asked. "What if instead of giving me special privileges, they created a program for all active military personnel? Maybe priority boarding or occasional upgrades when seats are available." The line went quiet for a moment. "That's actually brilliant," Diane finally said. "And excellent PR for them after this mess. I'll suggest it directly to the VP." Later that evening, as James helped his mother prepare dinner, she paused her chopping to look at him. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, "not just for standing up for yourself on that plane, but for how you're handling all of this. You're turning something ugly into something that might help a lot of people." James smiled, the weight of the past few days finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. "Sometimes," he replied, "karma really is watching." 6 months later, James stood in the lobby of the airline's headquarters, adjusting his tie nervously. He traded his military uniform for a well-fitted dark blue suit today. A large banner hung overhead. "Launch Day, Service Member Appreciation Program." "Captain Wilson, they're ready for you," an assistant said, guiding him toward a conference room where journalists and airline executives had gathered. As James entered, he spotted familiar faces. Diane Reynolds waved from a seat near the front. Tom Chen nodded respectfully from where he stood talking with a group of airline officials. Even Bill and Nancy, the older couple from the flight, had been invited and were beaming at him from the second row. The airline's CEO, a tall woman with a commanding presence, approached James with an outstretched hand. "Thank you for being here today," she said sincerely. "What began as a terrible mistake by our company has transformed into something meaningful because of your suggestion." James shook her hand. "I'm just glad something good came from it all." The room quieted as the CEO took the podium. Cameras flashed and reporters readied their notepads. "6 months ago, an unacceptable incident occurred on one of our flights," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "Captain James Wilson, a decorated soldier who has served our country for 12 years, was discriminated against by one of our employees. That incident forced us to look hard at our company culture and practices." She gestured toward James. "Instead of simply accepting our apology and compensation offer, Captain Wilson challenged us to do better. He suggested we create a program benefiting all service members, not just himself. Today, we launched that program." The CEO unveiled a large display showing the details of the new initiative: priority boarding for active military personnel, complimentary upgrades when seats were available, and a dedicated customer service team trained specifically to assist military families with travel needs. When it was James's turn to speak, he approached the podium slowly, taking in the roomful of people who had gathered because of what had happened on that flight. "When I boarded that plane 6 months ago, all I wanted was to sit in the seat I had paid for," he began, his voice steady. "I never expected to be standing here today." He paused, looking out at the faces watching him. "My father taught me that when something wrong happens, you have 2 choices. You can let it make you bitter, or you can use it to make things better. I'm grateful that the airline chose to listen and to make things better." From the audience, his mother wiped away a tear. She sat beside his sister and father, who had flown in specially for this event. The new program being launched today isn't about special treatment, James continued. It's about respect, not just for the uniform, but for every person who deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of how they look. After the speeches, as people mingled and journalists conducted interviews, Diane approached James with a glass of sparkling water. "Here's to Karma," she said with a smile, clinking her glass against his. "I still can't believe all this happened because of one flight," James replied. "That's how change often works." Tom Chan joined them, adding, "One incident becomes a catalyst when the right people pay attention." The airline had undergone significant changes in the past 6 months. Linda had been terminated after the investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior. The executive who had repeatedly buried complaints about her had also been let go. A new diversity officer position had been created at the senior leadership level. As the event wound down, a young flight attendant approached James somewhat shyly. "Captain Wilson, I just wanted to say thank you. I completed the new training program last month, and it's changed how I see my job. You've made a difference for passengers and for us staff too." Later, as James and his family left the building, his father put an arm around his shoulders. "You know what I'm most proud of?" his father asked. "Not that you stood up for yourself on that plane, but that you found a way to turn what happened into something that helps others." James looked back at the headquarters with its new banner. Sometimes the worst moments led to unexpected positive change. What had started as discrimination had ended with new awareness, new policies, and new opportunities, not just for him, but for thousands of service members to come. "That's the thing about karma," James said with a smile. "Sometimes it's not just watching. Sometimes it's waiting for us to help it along."